peace among those of disparate beliefs. The book proposes the term Abrahamic peacemaking, and the Abrahamic Faiths Peacemaking Initiative is a group of American clergy and religious activists who advocate peacemaking as an essential and defining mandate of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The book was published in 2006 in the aftermath of 9/11. Ms. Armstrong wrote, quote, "The tent of Abraham reminds us that the kind of confusion, fear, and dismay that so many of us are experiencing can be the start of a new religious quest," end quote. Common ground on which cooperation and peace between Israelis and Palestinians might be nurtured seems even more desperately needed today.
So turn your face and purpose toward the primordial religion of the upright, the Hanif, the nature innately formed by the one reality in which the one created humanity. Let there be no change in this work created by the one. This religion is self-subsisting, the standard, always resurrecting itself. But most among humanity do not understand. Turn to and remain conscious only of the one, remaining constant in prayer. Don't deify anything else in your life, not concepts or beliefs. Don't divide yourselves into sects that congratulate themselves on their own ideas. The Quran, Surah 30, verses 30 through 32. Religions don't have to divide. We've become accustomed to seeing religions as them versus us, rather than as opportunities to learn from one another. Religions like to claim truths for themselves. But the story of Sarah and Abraham is all about sharing. Sharing involves being willing to shift perspectives. What if the chosen child was Ishmael instead of Isaac, as many Muslims believe? What if it was Ishmael that Abraham had placed on the altar, rather than Isaac? What if, in having done even that, Abraham was wrong? Remember the story. God told Abraham to sacrifice his own child as a test. A rabbi once wondered if Abraham had failed that test by refusing to say no. It is wrong for a parent to sacrifice their child. And what many Christians suppose to be an act of piety and thoughtless obedience was a sign that Abraham had actually failed the test. He should have said no to God, so the rabbi said. It's a matter of perspective. Rashid Saad Shakur Chisti, whose given name is Neil Douglas Klotz, is a scholar of religion who directs the Edinburgh Institute for Advanced Learning. He has followed Sufi teaching for over 4 decades. Sufi is a mystic branch of Islam. He has shifted his perspective. During my own college days, I recall very clearly one of my Presbyterian professors telling me not to follow the path of the mystics. They're dangerous, he said. They don't follow doctrine. Thomas Merton was a Trappist monk in the Catholic Church. As he was preparing for his vocation, he nearly left the church because the constraints of what you could believe were just too great. Instead, after taking his vows, he decided to explore Buddhism. As a mystic, he crossed lines that turned out to be only drawn in the sand. His autobiography, titled The Seven-Story Mountain, implies in its very title that there is more than one way to experience transcendence. From the top of that mountain, infinite perspectives are available. Don't deify anything else in your life, not concepts or beliefs. Don't divide yourselves into sects that congratulate themselves on their own ideas. The words are from the Quran. They speak of an openness to other religious experiences. Not all Muslims appreciate Sufis with their mystical ways. Mystics, you see, seek a direct experience of the divine. They don't often keep doctrine pure. They encourage us to shift perspectives and try to understand that which is utterly different from what we might have expected. They welcome those who see from perspectives that are open to others.
Thank you, Steve, for helping us ask probing questions of the text and for lifting up the deep theology of mysticism and the power of a new perspective. Abraham's name wasn't always Abraham. In fact, he lived much of his long life as Abram. He was born Abram, grew up as Abram. He married his wife Sarai as Abram. He was called by God to leave his homeland as Abram. He lived through famine and quarrels over land as Abram. He had his first child, Ishmael, as Abram. And only then, while stargazing with Sarai, does Abram receive his new name. God promises that Abram's family will have as many descendants as the stars in the sky. And to prove it, God changes Abram's name to Abraham, meaning father of a multitude of nations. But the name change doesn't simply add a new meaning for this new stage of life. It also adds a new sound, the Hebrew letter Hey. Hey, also added to Sarai's name to make her Sarah. Hey, an H sound, a breathing sound, the same sound which appears twice in the four-letter name of God. This name, which Jewish tradition teaches us not to speak out loud, would sound very much like a deep breath if pronounced. Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who provides the Jewish interpretation of Abraham's story in this book, tells us that this is the origin for the translation of the name of the divine as breath of life, or breathing spirit of the world. UUs are familiar with this translation. Each Sunday we sing our beloved hymn, Spirit of Life, calling upon an energy, a breath of the sacred. In my own personal theology, I imagine God as wind, as a presence that can be felt but remains unseen. A presence that can cause destruction by storm and by gale and yet can hold us, can tussle our hair playfully, can remind us that we are loved. I feel God most deeply when I feel the wind and see it causing tree branches to bend and leaves to twirl. It's wind, this breath of life, that makes me feel connected to the great interdependent web of all existence. Rabbi Waskow writes, in all languages and cultures people breathe, and not only human beings, all life forms breathe. Indeed, their breaths are interwoven. I breathe in what the trees breathe out. The trees breathe in what I breathe out. And it's true, there's a certain universalism and connectedness to breath. And as I'm thinking about God as the sound of breathing and inserting the holiness of breath into Abraham and Sarah's names, I'm thinking about my own lungs. This time of pandemic has reminded us of the preciousness of breath, the way it alerts us to our own aliveness, our own fragileness. I am now hyper aware of the feeling of the process of breathing, which I was once able to do absolutely fine without thinking about it, thank you very much. But now it consumes my focus, fixated on the rise and the fall of my chest, the pause after my exhale before I realize I've stopped breathing and gasp for a bit more air. A disease that targets our respiratory systems has a way of making us notice infinitesimal changes in our breath. And as if we weren't thinking about our breathing enough already, I flick on the news at the end of May to be greeted with the pavement of Minneapolis. I see the officers standing around first, beside the police car, distracting us from the whimpers of George Floyd with a knee on his neck. And then I hear him say again and again, I can't breathe. The last words on his lips, I can't breathe. And I'm reminded again of Rabbi Waskow's assertion that in all languages and cultures, people breathe. And he's right, we do all breathe. But what this statement neglects is that we can't all take our breath for granted. All lives will only matter when Black lives matter. And all breath can only matter when Black breath matters. It is insufficient to say that we can all breathe when some of us were given extra oxygen to begin with, when some of us live in communities with clean, unpolluted air, and others, due to the impact of environmental racism, are left breathing in toxicity, when some of us have the breath choked out of our windpipes by police. And though we all need to, not all of us can breathe right now. One of the most well-known pieces of Abraham's story involves his tent. He's hanging out there on a hot day in the desert when God made God's self seen to Abraham in the oaks of Mamre. And he lifted up his eyes and saw, and here 3 men were standing upon him. And he saw and ran to bring them near and then to feed them. The text tells us that these 3 travelers are strangers, the kind of folks in the ancient world who bring uncertainty and danger. And yet Abraham welcomes them in with a rugged and radical hospitality. He offers them food and drink and a place to rest. He treats these strangers as family. Rabbi Waskow suggests that the order of things Abraham sees in this moment is important. First, Abraham sees God within the oak trees. And second, only then, does Abraham notice the visible, seeable presence of God within the travelers. How does Abraham see God in the trees? Is God chilling there, dangling God's legs off the branch, smiling and waving to get Abraham's attention? Perhaps. It could happen. But another possibility is that Abraham sees the rustling leaves quivering as the wind rushes from them, in them, to them. Here, Abraham sees God the way that I see God, in the breath of wind tussling the treetops. And in the words of Rabbi Waskow, it was not until Abraham saw God breathing in these oak trees that he was able to see God in human beings. Then he acted to affirm the holiness of what he now saw by feeding God, who of course is never visible, except in all that is around us. That is always visible if we open our eyes. Abraham opened his eyes, he saw God in the travelers, and he did what any sensible person ought to do when coming across the divine. He supported and cared for them. Abraham needed to be reminded of the divine in everything in order to recognize it in other human beings. And perhaps we too must shift our gaze and our focus in order to remind ourselves of the inherent worth and dignity, the inherent divinity within all of us. Through this lens, we notice when our siblings on this earth cannot breathe, and we work to make their breath easy and effortless once again. And when we, like Abraham, see the divinity in ourselves and in others, we offer each other shelter and food and drink, the protection of our bodies at protests, and our voices at city budget meetings deciding how much funding we ought to allocate to police. Cultivating anti-racist communities, defunding the police, these may feel like insurmountable tasks. And yet, we must persist. Joan Chittister, who offers the Christian commentary in this book, tells us about her experience organizing with Israeli and Palestinian women for peacebuilding work. She tells us of a planned gathering in Jordan, where for the very first time, a delegation of women from Gaza was expected to be in attendance. This was why they had chosen Jordan, a land where surely Palestinian women would be allowed to travel without restriction. But no. And Chittister tells the story far more beautifully than I ever could, so I'll share her words with you here. Then the pressure began to build. Israeli women called office after office to get permission for the women from Gaza to attend. The answer out of every ministry was the same. No, no, no. Clearly, we would have to go on without them. As organizers, we accepted the inevitable. Israeli women did not have to come here to have a meeting after all. And without an equal number of Palestinian women with whom to meet, why bother? But one Israeli woman refused to give up. Amit is a small woman but one of the greatest citizens of the universe I have ever known. She goes into Palestinian territory regularly to teach, to create programs, to make the human contacts that would make hate and fear and war impossible. She simply would not take no for an answer. Amit didn't stop at the desks of bureaucrats. She went instead to the office of the chief military commander in the area. Let these people go, she said, and he did. On the morning the conference opened, the word came. The Palestinians would be arriving late, but they would be arriving. Amit simply would not take no for an answer, and neither can we. When we cry, no justice, no peace, we aren't asking. We aren't waiting for someone to bring peace to our neighborhoods. We must seek out those with power and demand support for those who cannot breathe. And so I ask you today to allow the precious breath in your lungs to kindle your vision of the sacred, to remind you of the air within and around us, the divinity within and around us. And then, with the radical hospitality of Abraham and the fortitude of Amit, let's build a world in which that air, that divinity is protected, a world in which every one of us can breathe.